In my usually embarrassing way, I'm going to enter this very complicated topic with no notes, although I do have quite a lot of thinking around these topics. It's probably going to be hard to get them in a very tightly concise, coherent treatment of these issues, but this is generally going to be a kind of a suggestion as to how to conceptualize what's going on in the current political arena in South Africa with these very toxic and insidious forms of demagoguery and identity politics and kind of critical race theory infused morality, which is quite a nefarious and pernicious form of you can often see it in all the images of Julius Malema, which are attached to the news articles about the things that he says. He's always got this glare in his eyes, sort of trying to project a kind of sort of a radical fanaticism in terms of sort of as proof of his conviction. It has this almost Hitler-esque sort of glint in his eyes, that Hitler only produced, sort of in the middle of some of his speeches. Julius Malema has these kinds of, he poses for these shots, with this kind of glare to kind of condense the quite, what is obviously meant to be a provocative and a kind of insidious form of taking over the moral high ground, installing himself as the default moral arbiter over the situation with his very racialized reduction of these issues. Um, okay, so let me just talk about what I'm talking about. So there is this in the Free State. There was a farm murder, and there have now been demonstrations that have caused the damage of property. I think something. Well, I know that a police car was overturned in Satellite, and this is by a group of farmers or riotous farmers. That's what the general sort of story is. Now, in terms of why this happens this way, is because there's this general understanding, or there is this general idea that at the highest echelons of power within the ANC government, there is a concerted effort not to protect farmers' lives. And, this almost racial conspiracy is seen reflected in public discourse, within the rhetoric, within the toxic racialist rhetoric of today, which many, high-ranking ANC officials, even the Chief Justice himself, sort of broadcast this kind of, I would call it hate speech, which is also what I would brand what Julius Malema is doing, which is trying to inflame an already sensitive topic. And the particular venting of frustration against the police is more significant of the chief of police, who was already being called out directly by these demonstrators, who were basically at least signaling that they have no confidence in the chief of police, or the minister of police, and essentially this comes from a narrative that there was better security for farm people. There was this kind of, I'm probably going to get it wrong, but historically there was a frame in time when there were more, let's say, satellite police stations which were manned by people who came from those communities, from those farming communities. And so policing was decentralized for a time, and that allowed people to effectively feel safe because they had a responsive police force that they could access. And this was basically permitted somehow within the general legislation or within the regulations, but then all those structures were collapsed, and that sort of uh, uh, that facility was brought under the bureaucracy of essentially and that switch in policy, or that difference in strategic, it has been narrated, at least it has been interpreted by these farming communities as a concerted effort to make their lives more dangerous and more prone to being preyed upon by people who it is also seen within a narrative that they are empowered by politicians, um, and encouraged. And there are correlations to when certain songs are being sung and certain farm murders go up. So this is what kind of surrounds the narrative of the white genocide in South Africa, especially targeting farmers specifically, and why, for example, Australia has says that they will accept farmers from South Africa who are trying to escape the violence because they have somewhat interpreted it as at least politically, if not politically sanctioned, sort of politically insulated, or something like that, um, or that not enough is being done about it. So you can almost, this kind of issue could really be solved by leadership and by going back to the old policing system, um, which I look, my understanding of the details. I mean, whenever that happened, I think it was probably in the early 2000s or in the late 1990s, when they worked out that policing system. Um, okay, so that's the actual sort of basis of the issue. Then Julius Malema comes in and uh, not trying to broker peace, not trying to be helpful to the situation, but literally trying to stoke racialist hatred, using this as an opportunistic point to sort of, I mean, first of all, it's disgusting. He accuses the government of the day as being a puppet of these white farmers, which is why they're not taking a harsher stance against them. And the police chief also, uh, uh, or the Minister of Police, talks about how these people are uh, are demonstrating about nothing. I mean, I would just frame it in terms of, well, if we just went back to the old policy, then we could definitely say that these people don't have a cause to demonstrate. And so going back to the old policy and going back and then condemning them, might be a more rational kind of approach. But in the kind of, you can see the kind of racialist escalation which people like Julius Malema um, are toxically driven to creating, so that they can kind of justify their reactionary politics. Okay, yeah. So I wanted to get into the kind of into the political dimension of this, um, and how to, at least in a broad scale, with these kinds of because these are political issues that need to be commentated on. They need to actually have serious discussion around them, and obviously the kind of cultural landscape and political landscape that we're currently in, it's impossible to talk about them honestly because of bad actors like Julius Malema, because of his kind of poisonous and vile racialist, sort of tendency towards escalation and towards a kind of hyperrealism when interpreting these issues, and when literally trying to stoke and promote, violence, and to sort of to try to spark a civil war, which is kind of, um, I mean, if you take Hitler as an example in history, and a model for Julius Malema, which I think it's very clearly is his model of success, we have to understand that Hitler never won an election, and in fact, just before he kind of became the chancellor, his party actually won less seats than it did in the election prior to that. Julius uh, and okay, so Hitler came to power as chancellor because the Conservative Party of the day, or the traditional party, made him the chancellor because he was like, they thought that incorporating that kind of populism and or incorporating that kind of fanaticism as in a kind of leadership role would cement them as the kind of as a kind of umbrella, as a kind of, that they're embracing all these different um, stripes, or it kind of, that they had access then to a kind of the a large segment on the periphery of politics that they could kind of win as being part of their base, or amalgamate as being part of their base. And this is the end game that Julius Malema is obviously playing within the ANC. He at some point he wants to be asked to rejoin the ANC and to become the leader of the ANC, essentially, because the ANC, even if they aren't friendly to him at the moment, they are friendly to his politics, and many people in the ANC have that deep seated racialist uh, 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 politics that they tap into and which they try to use. And the only thing that Julius Malema can do is sort of be a stronger brand of that same kind of toxic politics, so that he can force himself in or back into the halls of power, and essentially an exploitation of the system. Um, so that, I think, must be, the ideology needs to be dismantled and attacked by its opponents. Um, People need to confront the ideology as it is shared by a significant portion of people within the ANC, and obviously as it is directly. I mean, because if people don't point out its kind of inconsistency and hypocrisy and its kind of toxicity, and it does all these weird things, like it kind of embraces using a disguise. It embraces all kinds of subterfuge and dishonesty, and it's sort of, and its biggest kind of lever of cognitive dissonance is something like the law of unintended consequences, that somehow their intentions, because their ideological vision is so pure, means that the law of unintended consequences can just be attached to the scapegoat in the ideological narrative. So, whatever unintended consequences that they sort of cook up and that they are responsible for, they can just divert and offload onto their ideological enemies. And you can see this in the COVID-19 response, that as long as you are seen as being reactive to the maximum in producing a hysterical, frenzied, um, so-called response to an issue or to a topic, it doesn't matter what unintended consequences um, uh, uh, proceed from whatever policy you have chosen. Unintended consequences are somehow just are morally negated. Become a kind of like an unknown quantity in some moral thing, and that unknown quantity just sits there to be diverted onto a kind of ideological scapegoat. In some sense, it makes the necessity for ideological scapegoating um, uh, uh, which then helps sort of create a bandwagon, which helps create a groupthink, a solidified groupthink. Um, so this is very dangerous, anti-democratic, uh, illiberal form of politics, where reason itself um, is cast as essentially the enemy to the radical revolutionary, however it wants to label itself. Just as Hitler labeled himself as everything that he thought was positive. He just accumulated all the brands. Suddenly he was a socialist. Suddenly he was, wearing red. You know, this is just natural to them. Like anything that has a positive connotation, they just appropriate it, and they don't argue. They don't make proper, stable claims to their moral high ground, and they just leverage very dishonest rhetoric in order to shift the burden of proof onto their opponents. So, I mean, an example that I've given of this before is by calling people phobic. By just calling people phobic, they have to prove that they're not afraid of the thing that they're against, and so they don't have to. No one has to deal with their reasons, because first they have to prove that they're not afraid, and that the reason why they disagree with something. First they have to overcome a negative argument as to why they're not afraid before their positive reasoning gets confronted. So, there are all these kinds of rhetorical tactics which are thrown. The blanket accusations do the same thing. So, when you've got this buzzword that you can just kind of deploy, and it has sort of based within it a kind of a blanket accusation, um, and is a kind of buzzword concept that everyone then is plugged into, because it's been, if you repeat a lie so many times, people start to think it starts sounding reasonable, that, oh, there must be currency, there must be an authority behind that. When you've got these so-called activist journalists just repeating all these buzzwords that have these blanket accusations built into it. Now, this is problematic, because how do you defeat an echo chamber? And I would say that, defeating an echo chamber does not necessarily mean convincing the people inside the echo chamber. You have to at least be able to convincingly defeat the echo chamber in terms of an impartial bystander, or a third group of people. And uh, you can hope to get the people who are on the fence. That should be your target. It shouldn't be the people that are already inside the echo chamber, but you do have to convincingly work out how to confront the echo chamber, and how to convincingly defeat its toxic rhetoric. So I'm going to go into some of these. Now, what I think that you do with this kind of toxic escalation, with their buzzwords and their blanket, which are basically blanket accusations, and their and shifting of the burden of proof, is that you have to neutralize those maneuvers by inculcating the same maneuver yourself. Trump actually accomplished this. So, this is what made Trump such an effective politician against the kind of reasoning of his opponents. Trump has perhaps it's very hard to confront this ideology face on, because of its layers of dishonesty, and it's even, because it doesn't have a coherent, stable line. Its line is like water. It just molds to the context of whatever is needed to kind of character assassinate its opponent. So it's not vindicating its own line more than it is bullying and sort of destroying the proponent of anything opposing its line. So it doesn't, it doesn't have a claim to be made. It's sort of it's premised on a kind of bad faith. So it's very tough. It's got basically so much pseudo intellectualism built into it that you can't directly confront it. But you can if you do it in a very kind of stable way, you can demonstrate its incoherence. You can demonstrate its feebleness. And that is sometimes hard to do, because you're going to have the opponent trying to derail you every step of the way. But I would say that one of the ways to start to create the lines, because you have to start creating a stable, you have to sort of start drawing lines in the sand. And then as you continually redraw the same lines in the sand, eventually those lines sort of become a meta superimposition, or they become a structure that people start to have in their mind, because they've started to model those lines that you keep on redrawing in the sand. And those lines essentially become the structure for reasoned thinking. And, because after you start redrawing these lines in the sand, and then you eventually show how you move between the different containers which are outlined by the lines in the sand. So you've got structures that have different component parts, and you can very clearly see how these component parts actually interrelate to one another, and how each of those containers contain the issues that need to be contained, how they deal with the issues, how they are actually a reasoned system of thinking and understanding that is up to the task of solving the problems that need to be solved. And then you kind of got that which you can distinguish and contrast against a system of thought which is literally just like it's just vacuous rhetoric using buzzwords that gets us nowhere, that has a whole lot of unintended consequences, which they don't take responsibility for, which they never hold themselves accountable for unintended consequences, and so you get a much worse situation, and you also get a much more corrupt situation. So that's the kind of the contrast that needs to be drawn, and the problem is that contrast is delicate. To it's a bit of a delicate operation to manage that, and because lines drawn in the sand are also part of the argument itself, are also, you can also slightly redraw them by, depending on how this, because if your opponent is going to make a semantic argument about how you're using a certain semantic preposition, then, it can be worth it to more delicately elaborate that preposition. It's not really that problematic. I mean, it can make it, it can be a source of being derailed and being diffused, and making it harder to describe a structure that functions. But at the end of the day, you only have to sort of get across essentially a concept. You don't have to get people to exactly believe in exactly how you said it, but it's a model of essentially how to reasonably deal with issues responsibly, and in which things are actually being done in a way that you can actually gain ground and you can actually make progress on an issue, rather than it being essentially an eternal conflagration that never gets resolved, that has no hope of ever sort of being improved as well, except by some kind of hypothetical ideological vision in which the destruction of the scapegoat gives you some kind of access to some imaginary, kind of re- re- retributivism, which somehow is the panacea to everything, as all the unintended consequences are ignored. And the sort of the senseless destruction and mayhem and destabilization and sort of gutting of the institutions to conform to these disgusting racialistic social justice so-called models of a corrupt morality. Okay, well, anyway, so what I think one of the ways to draw this line is one of the first lines is that when they unfairly move the burden of proof onto you and use blanket accusations, you should have counter blanket accusations. And I mean, and you don't have to be proud about your blanket. I mean, they have to be roughly true, but if they're going to have accusations which they don't have to argue for in good faith, then you should at the very least have the same arsenal of instruments. And I mean, and it doesn't, like and obviously, you should have a narrative that backs them up, because they've got a tautological narrative that backs up their blanket accusations. You should have a tautological narrative as well. It's not that you're proud of having a tautological narrative that backs up your blanket accusations, but if they're going to go there, you're also going to need to be able to go there. And this is also what Trump was so good at, is that he just labeled his opponents. Well, because he's sick of having his um, mentality and his politics smeared, and being accused of being a racist, which he's not a racist, and being accused of all these terrible, insane things. And he just hits back. He doesn't argue against the accusations being thrown at him. He just calls them something back. He just says that they're hateful people, and they're basically racist. Um, he gives something back at them, and they can't really deal with that, because what Trump is saying there is also, uh, you know, is also internally consistent. So it's just as valid as their blanket accusations. And obviously, if you hit back at them, and then they get incensed, and then they start trying to escalate things, and sort of lean into the hyperbole of accusing you of some heinous historical sort of thing, and being in league with some kind of force of oppression. You can just say, oh, you don't know my views on that, or well, that's a separable issue, and you're actually making that issue worse. And then you can kind of, in whatever retort that they give, it's really, it's the quality of their retort and your ability to essentially disarm, and to show up the substancelessness in their retort to your um, judo. Because you really have to wrestle with them long enough that you can extract enough of the toxic ideology and diffuse it and disarm it, that you prove that the whole thing is a con game. That the whole thing is, and so you've got like layers of dealing with this. um you need a superficial layer, because a lot of what they do is just superficial. So you need a superficial response to their superficial attacks, but then your superficial response has deeper roots. It can actually be explained in a reasonable way, in a structured way, where they just have a tautological narrative that goes nowhere. uh, that just has many unintended consequences. Your narrative actually has reasoned explanations and a whole structure and a value system that actually is capable of being accountable for unintended consequences. So, I mean, I'm outlining this, um, and I'm not giving the actual sort of the meat and the actual content and the actual details, but I'm outlining how the tree of the program of the platform has to function. And there are a lot of things that I mean, there are a lot of facets which can be, units of that structure, which can be, obviously they need to be deployed at the right time rhetorically, but that are, very important pieces. I made some notes. Let me just get them. Although this is probably going to be a bit disjointed, but yeah, I mean, and in the same way that Hitler was described as a political entrepreneur, you can see Julius Malema's political entrepreneurship when he gets into these issues, which he is obviously trying to incite towards a. I mean, literally disgusting as well how he says that he's mobilizing his ground troops. I mean, it's like, that kind of military. I mean, he's openly spoken about wanting to have a coup. This is like obviously fascistic and racialist hate speech. Anyway, but it's interesting as well because I think that you could also use his. Well, yeah, I mean, I would want to create a general narrative for the opposition that that the need for genuine leadership and also sort of regional leadership within our very now, or at least with Zimbabwe, this the world is changing. The structure of the world is changing. Stability, has to come from within. It's not going to be sort of extracted from the ether of a hysterical claim for social justice that has so many unintended consequences, and then who picks up the pieces. Um, that you make the blanket accusation now, and uh, uh, somehow everything takes care of itself because of the force of the blanket accusation, um, which is never examined properly um, by its adherents. Without the right kind of leadership of resolute values and sort of determination, we're not going to like have the. Okay, let me just. But anyway, I would just say that the need for leadership. I mean, that you could weave that perhaps into something that even if you want the ANC to be a future uh, uh, ruling party, for its own sake, it needs to lose an election so that it can actually clean itself out in house. Because while it has power, it has too many money hungry, sort of people that are dependent on corruption, that it's not going to be able to reform itself. That it would be much easier for the reformers to actually make real reform rather than just a kind of superficial reform. That, it would be much better if they would just at least lose a single election. Okay, well, some version of that could be used. And then you could also make the point that, well, we have all these blanket accusations thrown at us. Well, why don't you actually give us control of a government, and then you can judge us on our performance rather than just these blanket racialist accusations. If you're going to blame us for everything anyway, uh, or blame a section of the population for everything, um, why don't you actually give the Rainbow Nation a chance first? You know, and when I say us, I mean well, because I mean obviously not everyone in the DA is white, but there is this that they are the age. I mean, Julius Malema even accuses the ANC government as being agents of white farmers. So if this agency is going to be broadcast as a blanket accusation, like why not actually have a real integrated, responsible, sort of vision of the new South Africa before you judge it, because it has been betrayed. Uh, it's been betrayed by this element within the ANC, which is exactly, it is the Julius Malema style of politics that has corrupted the country and that has destroyed its capacities. So if it's going to, you know, I mean, so I mean, it's so disgusting when you have these people that are saying like the ANC government is the agent of white monopoly capital or something like that. I guess I haven't worked out exactly how to incisively deal with that hypocrisy without falling into the kind of the booby trap that exists there. But you can just see how much hyperrealism is built in their blanket accusations, and how convenient their blanket accusations are, and how sort of political leadership and accountability are just dissolved within these convenient blanket accusations. Um, yeah, I mean, I was thinking about how to deal with this, the ideological construct head on, which is essentially, I mean, the hydralisk that you have to kind of slay is, is problematic to deal with, because it has so many generalizations baked into it. It has so many kind of poisonous, but basically when you first, I mean, the concept of systemic oppression is already, uh, at least in the current way that it's being conceived, is a very problematic one, because it's invisible. You can't, you're not even allowed, it's not in the law. It's somehow in the culture and in the history. So it's like, it's said to be invisible. And essentially, okay, well, just to make it into a solid concept, that the systemic oppression of inequality, you see, you can just see how this sort of begs its own question, and it puts the cart before the horse. That, like, what do you deal with? You know, the principle of inequality, or the principle of equality, um, cannot be associated with a task to do with clearing up the systemic oppression of inequality. I mean, the systemic oppression of inequality is literally racism, is literally to use racism supposedly to just ends, or something like that. I mean, that's the kind of sentiment. Um, I mean, yeah, the systemic oppression of inequality is a kind of, is almost a fundamental technical construct from fascist philosophy and fascist politics. Because the only way to solve the systemic oppression of inequality is basically mass segregation and essentially something like separate but equal development. So, I mean, yeah, I guess this is the problem: is that all their all their racism is conveniently disguised and hidden in the very sort of convoluted premises of their worldview, where they already conceive of society in the same way that fascists conceive of society, sort of underlining problems. I mean, that are effectively sort of technical reductions and technical extractions which aren't even solvable. They don't even lead to being able to deal with the problem. Um, because I mean, I guess the one thing that's left out of the systemic oppression of inequality is inequality of what? And basically, the only thing that the South African state is allowed to deal with, in terms of its constitutional duty, is that it has to deal with the systemic oppression of inequality in disadvantage, I guess. But then you might as well remove inequality and just write the systemic oppression of disadvantage. although I know it's dubious if that's systemic oppression. I guess the word systemic oppression, I mean, the oppression of disadvantage. Why generalize it into a systemic oppression? You work out what the facets of disadvantage are oppressing people, and you ameliorate those conditions. You work out ways to facilitate opportunity that transform those problems. So yeah, I mean there are, the systemic oppression of inequality. Just it has like three different vectors of sort of conflating and reducing society in a very pseudo intellectual and dishonest way that you can just kind of you can, depending on which concept you're going to kind of sneak the racialism and the generalizations, the cherry pick generalizations, which are always convenient somehow to the people who have the kind of the plutocratic power, that are also covered by, somehow they're also victims of systemic oppression. And so as long as the inequality exists, they get to leverage their solution to the systemic oppression. It's kind of like a yes, I mean, basically, you don't have to. I wouldn't make their argument for them and deconstruct it, but basically, every time you are confronted by that kind of reasoning, you just say, like, how is that going to fix disadvantage, and how is that a disadvantage? Because they're often referring to things that either have nothing to do with actually fixing disadvantages, or their definition of disadvantage is this nebulous racial construct, which is basically systemic oppression, which is invisible and fundamentally a nebulous kind of evil, which I guess plutocrats can make much hay with nebulous problems, which are also said to be invisible. So it's like, or the only thing that isn't invisible about it supposedly is the scapegoat. That's the thing that anchors you to the problem, is the target. Um, and how this has also been sort of weirdly amalgamated with Marxist theory, which, you know, Marx didn't care about inequality, he cared about alienation. He cared about essentially the lack of access. And I don't know if I want to get into this, but in some sense, there are some Marxist responsibilities that the Constitution. This is this is a bit this is a bit of a tangent, because and all these things have horrible connotations, but it has a liberal Marxist bent, in that the government must always make sure that there's enough opportunity, or there's enough access, in order essentially to negate any potential alienation. But the kind of alienation that Marx was talking about was essentially that it was impossible to have class mobility, that it was impossible to have, that people would be so alienated from capital that they would not be able to do anything. But I mean, now essentially there are many industries in which essentially the threshold of capital is not such an important one to establishing oneself socioeconomically. In fact, what is a more important form of access is education, um, which is something as well which is completely ignored by identity politics in some sense, except to point at another sort of differential outcome as they ignore, actually doing anything about improving the supply and the access to it, except through a weird kind of redistributive, the only way to make, uh, is that let's not hold our political leaders accountable for dispensing um, quality education. Somehow it must just be redistributed to people. Uh, it's just this terminal, never-ending, kind of irresponsible and unaccountable political leadership. Because the scapegoat can just supply the cause, the explanation for the systemic oppression can just be explained via the scapegoat. Which is weird because, within this ideological vision of identity politics, which doesn't have a positive vision, the only thing that they can actually see clearly within their whole schema, within their whole ideological narrative, is essentially the enemy, the white privilege, or something like that. That is the truth and the fact, which becomes this kind of this overriding sort of thing. And then if you actually do any kind of statistics and you look at, how everyone has become poorer under this government and things like that, well, it doesn't matter because uh, the losses are more extreme with people that were already more vulnerable and dependent on a functioning system. So, even their own failures, which debunk their own sort of general thesis, somehow they repurpose as a kind of uh, toxic impetus for retributivism. Yeah, I mean, it is just that they are responsible for their positive intentions, and no one, uh, uh, no one but who they elect or who they. When I say elect, I don't mean in terms of an election. I mean in terms of who they point at, and no one except those who they point at have agency and responsibility for their unintended consequences. It's this very toxic sort of thing because it's so invested in a form of self-denigration that they sacrifice their own agency and they sacrifice their own accountability, and they denigrate themselves in that way. And then they say, well, the only way that we can recoup this denigration is by somewhat redistributing that self-denigration that we have essentially cultivated in ourselves as a kind of as a psychological um, freeze and a kind of stopgap measure that then needs to be redistributed and collectively burdened by the system, um, in a kind of diametrically calibrated way that absolves the collective of this problem. Uh, so the sort of this doubling down of this external locus of control and this lack of authentic self-esteem as a kind of ideological self-esteem is put in its place. And essentially, that ideological self-esteem requires a kind of parasitic trust um, that everyone must be plugged into, including the scapegoat, so that the scapegoat can supplement for um, the lack of confidence in the identity. And so essentially this kind of sort of identitarian narcissistic supply um, becomes the thing that makes the world turn, becomes the sort of, the human sacrifices that the Mayans made so that the sun would rise the next day. Sort of completely invested in this kind of cannibalism. But yeah, I mean, all the unintended consequences around their type of policy and their type of political interpretation. And the sort of the lack of responsibility for making, grown-up decisions and decisions that make sense and that have a kind of structure of reason behind them. And instead, there's this kind of very strange emotional doubling down of going with this kind of flow of this very oversimplified logic, and which just lands you in this kind of mythologized tautological narrative. That all the conclusions of that narrative are used as the premises in that narrative. I mean, that's the best way I can describe a preposition like the systemic oppression of inequality. That is how they supposedly have a vision of anything positive, is by those two negatives which have to sort of intersect so that they can actually contact some semblance of reality. So you have systemic oppression and you have inequality, and combined they let you see the only thing that's real, which is supposedly white privilege. But it comes from these two, let's say, negative metrics, which are subjectively perceived. So you've got this very strange sort of relativistic moral relativism, which is somehow beyond the system judging it from nowhere. And because essentially it has no real values, then it cannot be resolute, because it just has these kinds of these vampire values, these parasitic values, which are locked into perceiving a kind of this denigration, because without that self-denigration there is no fuel to challenge or even interpret the kind of the scapegoat and the boogeyman. Um, I mean, this is when you start tracking the notion of trust, how trust is essentially abused as a kind of ideological medium, and so that people can't even navigate their own lives by trusting their own vision, because instead it's supplemented by the ideological narrative, which gives them that kind of that disembodied, um, abstract solution for their identity, that then they are forced to trust in the identity beyond anything. Um, that then, that they're completely driven within their own minds, that they can't even interact and see real opportunities or understand or cultivate and curate their sense of who to trust and what to trust, and what to learn about, because the only thing that they have to know is about the identity. And so it kind of forces you into a kind of perpetual infantilism. You become a child of the ideological narrative, and then you need a savior to save that narrative. You need a Führer. That's what Führer means, is savior of the system. Okay, well, I guess that's. And sadly, yeah, I mean, we're still culturally prone to this right now. This is still somehow the echo chamber, and the activist journalists have regurgitated this narrative, that they've trained people into it. They've trained people into this disgusting morality. Um, they've made people addictive to essentially predicting their life, and being sensitive to reality through the vehicle of their identity. And why do you have to actually hold yourself responsible for making a bad decision, or not knowing enough, and then learning that you need to go and know something, and learn something, and trust in the right things, and sort of, instead of navigating your life through trust, you just, no, you trust the fact that the only reason why you got it wrong was because injustice was done to your identity. That becomes the crutch, that becomes the alternative description of your reality. And so you have to trust in a disembodied, abstracted description that essentially devours your real life. And so you don't have the capacity for trust. You have a kind of predictive, entitled expectation around your identity. And once you become essentially adopted by that, you are, and I mean, that is a general formula that many people are prone to in many different facets. Like it used to be that, I mean, that could also be why certain subcultures exist. They exist around that kind of huddling together to kind of extract narcissistic supply by leveraging a kind of a blanket accusation for a kind of, that there's a special, there's a special self-denigration and self-pity, which is a kind of narcissistic injury that you have nursed. And essentially it's, as a group or as a subculture, you can indulge in that kind of toxic, parasitic, subversion of trust, into a kind of paradigm that means that you can just depend on an external locus of control, and you never actually have to develop competence and ever generate authentic self confidence, because you can always just extract the ideological version of self esteem, which never actually is real self esteem, but it's a kind of hypothetical claim as to the self esteem that you would have had but for the so called social injustice. And so social injustice has completely changed its meaning in terms of its original meaning. It was first used by Orwell, but it was also used, or which is in the same sense that it was used in the South African Constitution, is that social justice is justice for the individual against the collective, against groups. It's not justice for a group versus some comparative contradistinction to some other group. So it's ironic that social justice has literally come to be interpreted as its exact opposite, that essentially because of some group description of some narrative between groups, individuals can be targeted for inequality before the law, for special treatment, for special extractions. And under that kind of corrupt vampire morality, you just have an industry of corruption, of state corruption, which has been morally sanctioned essentially under this brave new political epoch, which will sadly eventually just evolve into more and more sort of fascistic politics unless it can be ideologically confronted. I need to clean up something in the last recording, so I mean, I kind of mentioned it after saying it that what I just said was not a viable rhetorical response that would work at debunking identity politics. Um, I was trying to play with the idea of, and the reason why I'm addressing it now is because I still think that I'm onto something, that being able to rhetorically be quicker than identity politics is necessary. You need to be able to run circles around it, and that's hard to do because I would say that even though I conceptually understand identity politics, actually confronting sophistry, working out viable tactics of opposing the ideology rhetorically in dialogue or in engagement or in sort of an actual exchange of retorts and such require uh, requires fleshing it out in practice, and there are a lot of things that aren't going to be possible until you actually are reading the kind of the intellectual bad faith, and sort of tap into the style of it, and then also simultaneously uh, head it off. I mean, in some sense, you have to cotton on to its strategy and be two steps ahead of it, and you kind of have to craft a bit of a prediction or something like that in order to prove that you've cracked its formula, in order to demonstrate that it's a kind of formulaic sort of tautological um, you know that it's begging its own question, as it were. But so uh, and in demonstrating that in practice, okay, that's what I was trying to explore. So I just want to clean up this thing. So the thing that I already said, that I underlined, that would not be a viable response um, to them. But essentially, what I was trying to describe technically, in some sense, or now I'm going to give a technical translation of what I was trying to do when I was talking it out, is that, and I'm going to give notes on basically how you would do this then in practice, sort of in the vein of what I was trying to do, but which I failed to do in the last recording, which is that essentially what you want to do is you want to lend it a premise of good faith in order to explore and then ultimately demonstrate its intellectual bad faith and dishonesty. And so the kind of the premise or the question that I gave as an example of engaging in their ideological narrative is basically is trying to ask them an open question, and then obviously you don't know what they're going to say, but depending on the answer, that there are sort of, so I'm going to try to classify different cases, I guess. So, but basically, so you're going to lend them the premise of good faith, and you just want to say, okay, well, if you were wrong in your worldview, if you're wrong in your how could it be proven? What proof would you need that your diagnosis of South Africa, or your diagnosis, your identity politics or narrative, what evidence could there be that you are wrong? And so that was basically what I was trying to drive at as being the wedge to dismantling and diffusing their narrative, is by sort of asking them an open-ended question like that, like, you know what would you have to see to prove that your narrative is essentially is just based on sort of blind hatred and a very convenient form of scapegoating, um, and cultivating a disgusting sort of emotional cult around trusting in identity politics beyond any other consideration, or something like that. I guess that's a bit of a leading question, but you say, like, but essentially I was trying to create some kind of hook where you would, you see, it is actually very problematic trying to disprove their actual narrative, because their narrative is fundamentally tautological. There's no way to repeat it, or to repeat part of it and then kind of show that it's self-inconsistent, or show that it's impossible. Okay, so trying to agree with them first to then disagree is problematic, because their worldview is so sort of embedded in all these sort of in all this kind of racialist dogma, and then half agreeing with their racialist dogma in order to wait for some absurdity to precipitate, then it rhetorically becomes difficult to disentangle yourself, because then they'll just take that you're agreeing with partially some of their premises, and so you actually, anyway. So in some sense, the challenge that should be issued should be more like, well, you know, uh, would be to ask them to precipitate a test. Like, how would you test that your hypothesis and that your diagnosis is correct? How can you test your hypothesis? And they'll say it doesn't need to be tested. It is the truth, or something like that. So it's just a blanket, blind assertion. It's just assumed to be true, based on what? Well, there is no evidence because there is no test. So I mean, I guess if they don't want, so if you ask them what is the test to prove that their narrative is correct, and if they just point to the kind of hysterical propaganda of statistics, I mean, I guess, well, yeah, I mean, then I would say, well, who has had control over the country? Who has had control over policy? Have we actually given an alternative any chance? I mean, before the New South Africa was betrayed and replaced by racialist uh, policymakers, essentially. At what point do people become responsible for the consequences of bad policy? Yeah, I mean, I guess this is just none of this is very clear, or helps delineate the. But in some sense, there is. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to convey is that there is a kind of formulaic way of, when I not formulaic in that there is a strategic way in which you can engage with these ideologues in order to get them to admit certain points of evidence, or get them to engage with them in such a way that they make embarrassing contradictions, where they show the hole in their thinking, essentially, where they, because there are certain links in their reasoning which has to be kept nebulous and vague and confused, because without being able to merely conjecture over those issues, the cohesiveness of their worldview just like falls apart in tatters. And in some sense, it's not enough just to try to define those confused. I mean, I guess in some contexts you can uh, find those confused issues and raise them directly, but in some sense, it's much better to extract it as part of a dialogue, where you find a simple question and you put the question through, and then do they answer it? Do they answer the challenge? And then based on how they answer the challenge, you demonstrate that that they keep on conforming to a kind of a blind sort of tautological narrative which doesn't make sense, and that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. And it's a convenient sort of political game piece, but it's also representative of a style of policy which is fundamentally corrupt, morally corrupt, and facilitates state corruption, and that it's quite cynically being advanced by its proponents, who are advancing it in this way because they see it as a route to unaccountable leadership and unaccountable political power, which is essentially what has precipitated the problems in a betrayed New South Africa. Um, hmm. And I mean, I think in some sense this can be combated by making many different arguments that come to the same conclusion, and you end up just repeating that conclusion. But that conclusion must be a direct attack on the credibility or the integrity uh, um, of this very dark ideology, and this this putrid narrative that's premised in trusting identity beyond anything, beyond any other consideration, beyond having an individual sense of trust. And so labeling uh, the ideological opposition as being a friend of corruption, or being, and then making many different arguments that lead to that conclusion, that lead to that very hard conclusion, where you are placing the onus of a whole political, um, a whole politically themed diagnosis of the problems in the country, but also how they are politically fueled and how they are politically maintained. Um, mean, Julius Malema is certainly. I mean, I described it in the last recording. I mean, as I've described, Hitler never won an election before he became chancellor. He never won a single election, and in fact, his party did less well in the uh, right before he was made chancellor by the Conservative Party. And in the same way, that is the same, let's say, strategy of demoralization and skewing the political arena and contorting the political arena to make it conducive to fascistic politics and to racialistic obsessions with the kind of the identity politics and the scapegoating and the blanket accusations. When that becomes the norm, then you end up needing to have leadership figures that plug into that distorted reality picture, because otherwise it looks like that you're, inverted commas, out of touch. I mean, this is why, for example, Musi Maimane plugged this disgusting moral corruption into the DA's politics, which only recently has now finally been excised from the party. But yeah, there needs to be a kind of a positive argument, sort of labeling certain forms of policy, certain forms of ideology as the friends of corruption, or as the cohort of corruption, or as the support system of corruption. Um, I can't. It would be better if it was a more aggressive accusation. I mean, I keep saying the moral corruption that precipitates state corruption, um, or the moral confusion, uh, which is so badly intellectually premised that it can only survive by creating an orthodoxy of blanket accusations and a very strange sort of external locus of control, which collectively adopts everyone into this new reimagination of social justice, which is a corruption of social justice. Um, as the words in the Constitution have been contorted and corrupted to facilitate, a very strange kind of self-denigration, which then doubles down into needing to attack other people in order to compensate for its own weird form of self-denigration, where they are not even responsible for the unintended consequences of their very bad policy. And so without political accountability, there is just no hope of resolution. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess and then I think when that kind of polemic is being cast, then I think you can start to say things like the ANC, even if you like the ANC and you want the ANC to be a good party, it's not a good party. It needs to lose an election. We don't even need to be the winners of the election, but the people who have this corrupt politics must lose the election so that we can have a hope of some kind of revival. We can have some kind of intelligent policy and rooting out of the corruption. I mean, there are a lot of positive signs around the ANC, but it's always been, sort of shifting seats on the Titanic. I, it's quite likely that the goal of cleaning up the ANC is not going to be accomplished. Um, I mean, there might be a new way of disguising the corruption or something like that, but without an electoral defeat, it's unlikely that the ideological structure of the party is going to be able to disengage itself from its moral corruption, which is the parent of state corruption, essentially. Because as soon as you've got things like token empowerment instead of disadvantage empowerment, um, the policy itself is blind to corruption, or it already conflates the advancement of a weird kind of tokenism, and then that will always facilitate the politically connected and plutocrats. And while it also debases the system, because it also makes it impossible for actual transformation to occur. It's kind of like transformation by fiat is not transformation. It's not authentic transformation. And neither does it have to be interested in developing mechanisms and insight and knowledge about how to effect transformation, uh, because that's just how vacuous and hollow identity politics is, or um, these weird sort of ideological things, because essentially it can just sublimate all of the things that need to happen into essentially attacking the scapegoat. That as long as you're bringing down the enemy, the ideological enemy, it doesn't matter. Um, because relatively, then you are succeeding in engineering toward equality, but it's not useful equality because you haven't uplifted anyone. In some sense, you've just actually destabilized the system even more, and you've reduced the resources available that could have been put towards intelligent development, or intelligent transformation, or policies that actually do positive things rather than essentially trying to fix a ratio of power. Anyway, so I guess all of this is a bit too clunky to be useful, although perhaps it's useful on a conceptual level, but that's not very helpful rhetorically. But I mean, I guess something could be made about depriving people of actual self confidence by not allowing them to develop actual competence. and skills, and go through processes where they develop, because instead the only thing that is developed in identity politics and token um, sort of token upliftment is the identity itself. Is that the pride in the identity is enhanced, while the equality of the individual is left uh, unattended to. So it's this kind of ideological framing, or reframing rather, of reality, instead of actually doing anything tangible, doing anything useful to promote development and transformation, other than to bring some people down and in the process enrich some plutocratic sort of token representative of the identity, so you end up propping up this very artificially created sort of politically connected kleptocracy, and more of the, let's say, authentic economy gets destabilized, so there's even less capacity to support things like through taxes, and not to mention the huge mismanagement of so many things, like I mean, there are things that have to be done at some point. Someone has to take on the teachers unions, and to completely revamp education in this country, um, as it just keeps on getting diluted and destabilized and ideologically corrupted by also this identity politics, moral corruption. But the amount of money that we spend on education and the quality of education that we have in this country is it's insane.